We help aspiring kettlebell coaches become confident as kettlebell practitioners and educators in only 10 weeks. If you want to find out more about our method, check the first link in the description and sign up for our waiting list. Ladies and gentlemen, another episode of the Kettle Nights podcast. I have with me Professor Robert Robergs from Australia. We had a great conversation the last time I had him on. We talked about Pavel's new book. We talked about glycolysis. We talked about energy transformation and metabolism. But Professor Robergs is actually specialized in a field that is much more broader. It gives us the bigger perspective. And it was so funny. He sent me an email and he said, Gregory, this is the stuff that you have to read for a conversation. And I felt like a student, which I thought that was awesome. Yeah. My professor's giving me assignments. So I did part of the assignment. I read through the manuscript. It's very interesting. So what we're actually going to talk about is the broader picture of acidosis, right? So Rob, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you.
Yeah, great to be here. Yeah, I enjoyed myself. So yeah, I
awesome.
hope the audience, gets a lot out of it.
Yes, we have a lot of coaches and trainers listening, and since the topic that you're discussing is closely related to exercise, that's the reason why I brought you on the last time. And so why don't you give us a big overview in layman's terms what acidosis is and how it relates to exercise, and your perspective, how you got into the field of this particular area.
All right. Well, generally speaking, I mean, when we get acidic, it just means that our pH lowers. And so then it depends on what tissue you're referring to. So normal blood pH is about 7.4. And so when you get acidic and you're measuring blood, it might go down to 7.3, 7.2. In severe disease, for example, blood pH can go below 7, right? And that's just really diabolically severe. But blood's a highly buffered tissue, so that when we say buffered, we mean that there are molecules in blood that actually can bind to hydrogen ions so that it retards the pH from lowering too much. And we can talk about buffers a bit later if we want, but we'll focus on acid stuff right now. I mean, muscles at rest, our muscles about pH 7, and it can drop down to pH 6.8, pH 6.7. If you picked up most research articles of intense exercise and muscle metabolism, and if they measured muscle pH, it might go down about 6.7. But when you look at the studies that are really, really severe in how they incur exercise, and when you look at the methods, like, for example, if you use magnetic resonance, so like if you have a model that uses when you go to get an MRI and you get your body imaged, they can change how that works and actually get what's called spectroscopy, or they can actually measure metabolites. And so when you get that sensitive measurements, we know that muscle pH can drop down to the low 6s and be incredibly severe. So that's acidosis. It's just a lowering in pH. And when blood pH lowers, we don't feel great, right? We feel nauseous. We feel lethargic. We are grumpy. We want to stop, right? That's the drive we get. In muscle, though, it's been controversial because we used to say that acidosis was really bad for contracting muscle, but boy, in the last 20 years, there's been such great research to show that muscle tolerates acidosis really, really well. And there are certainly some negative markers that and function that can happen, but muscle is more adept at tolerating acidosis than is our brain, for example. That's the problem with our acidosis in the circulation. Our nervous system doesn't do well with acidity, and the mechanisms aren't all that clear. But so that's the acidosis scenario, and it's core to exercise physiology, because when you train somebody, we mostly do interval training, and we train to stimulate an overload, and that means working the muscle and the related systems that support the muscle more than they can tolerate for a steady state response, and that will often always incur some form of an acidosis, and then we recover and we go again. And that's our training stimulus, and we know interval training works better than long, slow distance. That's why all our more elite endurance and even power-based athletes do all sorts of great interval training, and with a lot more care on recovery than existed about by attitude about 30 years ago. So acidosis is there; it's crucial. Many physiologists and biochemists might argue that it's also part of the adaptive mechanism as to how we improve with training. So, it's a power athlete's nemesis and also friend because it helps them. It helps them maybe adapt as well as incur their contractile failure and deteriorating performance.
And the
So that's the
last time,
acidosis part. So
yeah, and that leads to it just harkens back to the discussion that we had the last time when we were talking about, hey, there is this idea or this philosophy behind anti-glycolytic or maybe even anti-acidic training. So
yeah,
in an effort to avoid acidosis because it is bad for the body, right? That's the last time why I got you on the podcast in the first place to talk about this. And you're saying, well, it is part of the adaptive system, or it's actually required for the muscles to adapt. And we know that, right, with a solid intensity level, of course, we don't want to overwork people, right? First, do no harm. We understand this, but it's how we work with clients. We push them to a certain level, and of course, everybody has their individual response and level, but you want to reach a peak where your body is forced to adapt. And I think it's fascinating what you've mentioned, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this because I can give you maybe some practical feedback. Because you're saying the body, the muscle can tolerate a low pH level better than the brain, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So the brain elicits that response when we train that, oh my God, I'm dying, right? And but the muscle, right? But the muscle actually tolerates this better in a sense that if these two would have a conversation, the muscle would be like, hey, I'm fine, don't worry.
Yeah, pretty much, because other biochemical factors are more detrimental to muscle contractile function than pH.
Okay, so the brain.
That's clear. Yeah, that's
great. So if we put this in perspective in very layman's term, let's say the brain overreacts to a certain extent.
Yeah, maybe. Yep, that's fair.
Okay, and I feel that when we train with kettlebells, there's an interesting aspect of kettlebell training that says we spend a lot of time on the tension. For example, that's hardcore, but we do in a competition set, for example, you do 10 minutes of a snatch. So that's one exercise. You snatch the kettlebell up and down for 10 minutes, and you only have one arm switch. So you can only switch the arm once, and then if you have to switch again, you have to drop the kettlebell and the set is over. That's competitive, right? But even in a training sense, we also take it to the next level where we say we spend, let's say, 6 minutes under tension. We do 2 minutes of swings, 2 minutes of the clean and press, 2 minutes of snatch. That means there's lots of time under tension. The kettlebell doesn't touch the floor. And here's what's happening. When we train with beginners or people who are not used to, their face does this, right? So it's like the brain is eliciting the response and the face is going accordingly. It's like, I'm dying, right? Yeah. And what we're actually saying is try to put on that poker face because you're able to tolerate it. Your brain just sends these signals and you have to resist them to a certain extent. So this is just from the experience. Yeah.
If we expand on the last podcast, the muscles are also hurting, and any athlete will say their muscles are screaming, and that's all going on as well. But what I'm saying is that the role of pH decline in that screaming and deteriorating contractile power is nowhere near as direct and cause and effect as we thought it was, once was. So there's so many other things going on. I think we touched on the fatigue mechanisms in that last podcast. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
the muscles are, they're still a part of it, and they're still contributing to that brain processing of all our sensory cues, but certainly there's also a direct role of the acidosis on our neural system because it drives the nausea and it drives some of the other behavior as well, right, directly. So it's certainly a challenge, yes, but we adapt to it, right? That's part of the power athlete response. I mean, the 400, 800 meter, 1 mile runners couldn't do what they do, right, without tremendous adaptation in improved buffering capacity, improved hydrogen ion transport out of muscle, improved blood ventilation buffering of the hydrogen ions. So there's tremendous improvement that can happen, and just the elite levels of athletic performance, show that.
And from a scientific perspective, we can say, or we can, let's say, I like to phrase this better. From a scientific perspective, we can assume that if we want to reach these elite levels, we have to push the body into acidosis on a regular basis. Not, of course, overdoing it, because there's an interesting, maybe you can touch on this a little bit, and I don't want to steer too far away from the topic, because you're the expert here. But in CrossFit, they call it rhabdo. It's the short form.
Yeah, rhabdomyolysis.
Rhabdomyolysis, exactly. So this is probably where the thinking comes from, where people say, see, that's what happens if you always go into acidosis. You develop rhabdo. Okay.
Yeah, rhabdo's fine. We'll call it rhabdo. Yeah.
Okay. So what is the where is rhabdo coming in with acidosis and always going to the extremes? Because we know we have to push our bodies, right? But not overdo it. So
I think it's the routine story with acidosis. It's just a partner in crime that gets blamed, that isn't really doing much of the crime at all, right? It's just there, right? And rhabdomyolysis, there's a etiology, diverse cause of it. I mean, some environmental physiologists, if they were here, they'd talk about heat stress, and severe hypothermia will induce chemical reactions that shouldn't be occurring, at the same time with some structural damage to muscle that then unleashes a cascade of proteolytic enzymes, and we have protein breakdown and increased protein in the serum, and that can lead to long organ failure, right? Liver, kidney. And so the deaths, and thankfully we don't hear about a lot of them anymore, but the deaths from athletes training excessively in summer heat and humidity. And I remember during my study in the US, right, in the 80s and 90s, that almost every year there'd be an athlete, a young high school athlete or a college athlete, training in the summer for American football, and they've got all the, clothing on, which is leg pants, right? Not shorts, but leg pants, and their gear and their protective gear and the helmets, doing this heat stuff. And training has changed since then. I mean, it's not as brutal as it was back then. Toughen up or leave was the concept, back in those days. But, we've now applied a lot more common sense and science, and we care a lot about cooling. So anyway, so those athletes who became hypothermic, that increased core temperature triggered a lot of these undesirable cellular mechanisms to cause essentially destruction of mainly skeletal muscle, because that's where most of the heat was produced. But rhabdomyolysis can also occur in response to severe eccentric exercise, when it's done when the person isn't used to it, and that can induce some excessive muscle damage, and so the same thing happens. And so a lot of that is occurring with more intense exercise, because more intense exercise releases more heat, because you're releasing more energy from higher metabolic rates, so there's greater energy turnover, and 75% of the energy release from metabolism is released as heat. So, the more fit you are, the greater your energy transfer, the greater your heat release. So heat stress is more a problem for the more elite athlete, because they're generating so much heat, and they're more adapted, but they're still generating a lot of heat. And so an untrained person is also at risk, but they're at risk because they haven't adapted as well as a trained person, but they're producing less heat because they're less trained. So it's a bit of a counterbalance thing there.
Yes.
But that's why most of the stories of heat damage are, they're dealing with more trained athletes, that are doing it, or they're experiencing it. So that's rhabdo, right? And acidosis is just a guilty partner, because it mostly involves more intense exercise. So there's acidosis going on, but I'm not aware of for acidosis inducing mechanistically part of the rhabdo.
Okay, so just for my basic understanding, rhabdo has more to do with the heat formation that occurs when we train and less with the acidosis.
Yeah, heat. Well, yeah, but extreme, right? So this is a really extreme heat stress, um, and so and coinciding and or with structural damage from excessive movement or muscle contractions, mostly eccentric, that have
Mostly
not been
eccentric. Interesting.
trained, not been trained to have
Hmm.
that prior adaptation. I mean, we adapt really well to eccentric exercise, but you do something foreign and you do too much of something foreign, we don't have that prior adaptive mechanisms to minimize the damage. So,
Yes, yes, yes.
yeah,
But we can assume a little, or we can point a little bit into that direction. Yes, of course. I always use this terminology where I say if load exceeds capacity, injury is probably around the corner.
yeah,
So it doesn't matter if it's a swing, if it's a pull up. If you use too much load and your body doesn't have the capacity to handle the load, this is where injury happens.
yeah,
But in
yeah,
in terms of rhabdo, this is where CrossFit, at least in the fitness realms, and that's of course that's a little bit longer ago. Everything has changed a little bit since then. But this is where CrossFit gets that bad rap to a certain extent, and this is where the other side, or this other the anti mentality comes from. It's like, see, if you always go balls to the walls with your training, you totally overdo it, you become totally acidic. It's that high intensity, high acid training that burns you out and you're almost dying. That's the reason why you then develop rhabdo. So here, that's the problem, right? But it seems like that's a little bit of a too basic understanding of it all. Yes, acidosis is attached to the mechanism, but it's actually just, if we boil it down simply, you do way too much. You're overexerting yourself, and it's probably a heat problem as well that's attached to it.
yeah. Heat and structural damage would be the two
Oh,
main
heat and structural damage. Okay.
components to induce rhabdomyolysis or rhabdo. Yeah. I mean, again, acidosis is just we have a hate relationship with acidosis. And there's a lot of history to explain that, and we can go down there whenever you want. I can
Yeah,
go over
please
this.
go ahead. Please go ahead, because the only thing that I know from my perspective is, like I mentioned in the book that I have right here with me, which I want to quote just a little bit from, because I think the manuscripts that you shared with me, for people who tuned in before we got started, the manuscripts that you've shared, they seem to throw the current scientific landscape when it comes to acidosis, or at least to how we perceive what acids really mean when it comes to the body, and how it metabolizes acid a little bit on its head, because it seems to really point us into a new direction, which I think is fascinating. Of course, you can
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but please go ahead on elaborate on acidosis as far as you want. I'm
Well, yeah. All right.
totally
So
up.
so we'll start with lactic acid, right? Let's go down to it. And
Yes,
the
yes.
crucial question is where do the hydrogen ions come from? Because pH is essentially mathematically, right, defined as the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. So
Mm-hmm.
the higher your hydrogen ion concentration, the lower the pH is going to
Mm-hmm.
get.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also controversy. They're not really controversy. It's even a bit more complicated than that, because it's all about the ionization of water. And when we say increasing hydrogen ion concentrations, we're really having more hydrogen ion activity. So we're getting H3O instead of H2O, but that extra hydrogen ion is moving around into and out of solution. So we call it a hydrogen ion activity, but that's just getting too academic. So
Mm-hmm.
the layperson doesn't really need to know that. But the
Mm-hmm.
all right, so and lactic acid has just been the culprit of so much blame, and it's all explained by history because, gosh, lactic acid as a molecule was isolated in the late 18th century. It was identified in different tissues. I mean, it was called, lactic acid based on lactate. I mean, it was originally isolated from sour milk, right? So lactate, that's the derivation of its name. So that goes back to the 18th century. It was isolated, purified in the early 19th century. were identifying, chemical structure was known back, in the late 19th century. And back in those days, they were still debating what an acid was, right? But because the Arrhenius theory relates that an acid really, again, it's just one definition of an acid. There are multiple definitions of acids, but the Arrhenius theory is that, it's a molecule that releases a hydrogen ion and then takes on the positive charge with mostly a metal like sodium, potassium, magnesium, right? And even that's not necessarily accurate, but that kind of describes what our main understanding of an acid is. It's a molecule that can release a hydrogen ion and gets replaced by this ionic bond with a metallic atom. But we didn't know all the nuts and bolts about acids really until, the early 20th century. That's when our understanding became more clear. And it wasn't until about the 1940s and 50s that we knew about the pH dependency of how the hydrogen ion movement to and from an acid-like molecule behaves and is quantifiable. So when all this research started assaying for lactate, really, we'll call it lactate. Mm-hmm. Pre-1950s and 60s, it was always called lactic acid because that's what the prior 200 years of inquiry.
A misnomer, actually.
So it's just based on nomenclature, right? And we know in chemistry that molecules that have certain functional groups that we know chemically to be acid behaving get called acids, right? But that doesn't mean biologically that they're produced as acids, right? It's just chemical nomenclature. But the lactic acid vernacular, the wording, was ingrained for more than 200 years in how we understood cellular functioning and metabolism. And cells that were deficient in oxygen are going to get more acidic. Fruit, right, that tastes sour, right? Oh, it must be acids, right, that are doing it. And because of that historical wealth of knowledge about lactate and other molecules like lactate that have we call it an acidic functional group. It's a carboxylic acid functional group, C double bond oxygen, single bond oxygen. And the single bond oxygen has negativity and it can take on a positive charge. It can, if it has a hydrogen there, if it's a biological pH, it's going to come off. And that led to the whole idea that, wow, we get acidic because, cells produce these acid molecules and they release their hydrogen ions. And that's what's causing the acidity. But for some reason, right, the logic or the illogic of then just blaming one reaction when we know that there are literally hundreds and hundreds of chemical reactions in the body that end up producing an acid-like molecule, but we don't blame acidity on all those other acid-like molecules. For some reason, we've just accepted the fact that, well, there's only one reaction that's important, and it produces lactic acid. And that's the cause of our acidosis from exercise. If you're diabetic, it's the acids produced as ketone bodies, right, in the liver. That's the problem. And my work has documented, and I'll explain what led me to it, soon if you want, that, wow, that just doesn't make sense from a chemistry perspective. And
so just to put this in perspective, based upon your research, hundreds of years of a current understanding of the body's metabolism seems false.
Yeah. Now,
yeah.
You got to understand that I started this back in the late 90s. And the reason why I started it as a young scientist, or obviously younger than I am now, was that I found when a scientist reveals evidence that opposes the current narrative, right, we call it an anomaly, right? And I found all these anomalies in the research I was reading. And then when I was I took organic chemistry early on in my career, and that made me understand how atoms change in molecules during chemical reactions. So at the atomic level, I gained an understanding. I hated organic chemistry, but it's probably been the most important subject I've ever taken to my career. But it's horrible to study organic chemistry. I can't lie there, but it's been incredibly relevant. So then when you study biochemistry and you look at what reactions generate these acid molecules, and you see that they're produced, right, devoid of a hydrogen ion, and they're not produced as acids. And one lecture I had a question with the lecturer, the professor, and I said, well, these molecules aren't produced as acids. And he couldn't explain how that meant that, wow, that means, it's a whole different way to look at acidosis then. If the molecules we're saying are acids, but they're not produced as acids, then how do you explain acidosis? And he couldn't give me an answer, right? Yet in every biochemistry textbook still today, they would talk about presenting the molecules produced. So they show that lactate's produced, not lactic acid. And then there'll be a paragraph that says, but during intense exercise, right, hydrogen ions are released from lactic acid. That causes the acidosis. But in the prior structural chemistry, they prove that it doesn't happen. And then I asked my professor, well, there are these other chemical reactions that have hydrogen ions as substrates and hydrogen ions coming off as products. And I said, well, if hydrogen ions directly will cause, right, acidosis if it increases, and if you remove a hydrogen ion, well, doesn't that mean that you're opposing an acidosis? And my professor said, well, we just have the hydrogen ions there to balance out charge and atoms and just view them as being irrelevant. So that means my professor said that, well, some hydrogen ions are irrelevant, yet, and the only relevant one when it comes to muscle is the one that might be connected to lactate, which there isn't. That just didn't make any sense to me. So I started inquiring more and more and more about it, and I realized from talking to biological chemists that they all knew that, there's no such thing as lactic acid. Right, so this was in the 1990s. So there's a whole field of biological chemistry that recognized something that I wasn't taught, and I wasn't teaching my students, and the whole mainstream of clinical and basic science biochemistry wasn't teaching its students. And there I went. That was the start of it all. And the more I read and researched, the more I questioned and realized that, gosh, this is not right. Now, here's the interesting stuff, right? So I was like 5 years outside of my PhD, major anomaly to a 200-year-old construct. What am I going to do, right? What am I going to do? I was really freaking out, right? But I decided, and it was really quite damaging to me early on, but I decided that I've got to tell the truth. I've got to pursue the evidence and let the evidence take me where the evidence takes me, right? So that's why I started writing that, there are a lot of people who've been researching and writing about lactic acid, and, when you propose an alternate narrative with a lot of evidence, you create a lot of people who don't like you anymore. So, science can become a brutal place. And
wow.
But, where are we now? We're at like 30, almost 25, 26 years later. And, it's changed the landscape of how, athletes get trained. It changes how we interpret blood lactate measurements, and changes how clinical practice occurs, right? So that conference I was at in Prague, well, not in Prague, but north of Prague in the Czech Republic, was all about a conference about the latest research that affects intensive care physicians and nurses and how they treat their patients. And, physicians now, treat acidosis separate to lactate. They actually now infuse lactate as a buffer to actually to actually raise pH in these critically ill individuals, because if they get too acidic, it kind of like almost times 5 their risk for premature death, right?
Hmm.
So their morbidity worsens and their premature death is the reality if they get too acidic. So they treat their acidosis, and now instead of fearing lactate and trying to lower lactate, they now infuse lactate because it's going to take on a hydrogen ion and actually be a bit of a buffer. So it's just changing, clinical practice, and it just takes a while. Science is a slow moving horse. When you have a 200-year momentum, it
Yeah.
just takes a
Yeah.
long time to change that momentum. Um, and yeah, patience is a virtue in the science world, but it can be brutal, right? When you challenge a career, right, people
Yeah.
tend to not like it. Yeah.
You're raising very interesting points that go a little bit alongside what I pursue in that regard when it comes to kettlebells. I look at this tool from a perspective where I not yeah, maybe disagree is too hard, is too tough of a word, but I see it a little bit differently than most, let's say, institutions who are recognized as authorities in our, if that even exists in kettlebells, but it's just an assumed authority. Most of the time it's branding. These are just brands who've been around forever, and yeah, they are the ones everybody looks to. And we're kind of like creating a different idea of kettlebell training to a certain extent. And the interesting thing is that I don't do it intentionally. I don't think, hey, I'm gonna go against these guys, or my goal is to go against everybody. But I talk to lots of people. I have lots of experience with our clients. My own experience adds to this, and when I talk to this worldwide network of kettlebell coaches, I see that there comes up a completely different idea than what is currently or mostly taught in the sphere. So that's why some people do not like it if I say I see it completely differently, right? So, okay, this is how you're supposed to do it. And then I'm like, yeah, but I see it differently. But how
Yeah.
come? This guy said. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not this guy. It's let's put all the evidence and the
The
arguments on one
evidence. Yeah.
table.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm also willing to adapt. I don't care about this. I don't care about myself. This is not about me. This is about, hey, listen, this argument. Just recently I had somebody commenting on one of our videos where he said, yeah, but this and this and that. And then I responded. I said, I totally agree. This is an old video. I see it differently now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Right?
you have to change and move on. I mean, yeah, and that's progress, right? And then, but the whole lactic acid thing, has another twist to it, because when you look at the organic chemistry of that reaction, it actually consumes a hydrogen ion. So it's not that lactate doesn't even produce a hydrogen ion, right? It actually helps use
It
hydrogen
helps
ions
out.
and helps out, right? So
It helps out,
lactate
yes.
production in skeletal muscle is incredibly important for an athlete. So they're using lactate production to metabolically remove hydrogen ion. So almost one per lactate, right? It's just amazingly beneficial. And you're regenerating NAD, which is a substrate for a reaction, a really important reaction in phase 2 of glycolysis. So in phase 2 of glycolysis is your ATP yielding phase of glycolysis. And then you've got these lactate transport molecules that help transport lactate out of the muscle, and that also transports hydrogen ions out of the muscle. And there are other hydrogen ion transporters to get hydrogen ions from muscle into the blood. And so when you train, you actually improve the number of these transporters for lactate on the muscle membrane. And the more lactate you get out, the more you can keep producing. Right?
Yes, the more efficient you are, yeah.
And so you would hypothesize then that, like a power athlete, all else being equal, higher lactates would be a good thing, right? If you're doing a lot of intense exercise and you're going to be in contractile failure after 2, 3, or 4 minutes, right? Producing more lactate means that your muscle's getting it into the blood more, which means you must have more transporters. That lactate can be taken up by other tissues, right? You're helping get hydrogen ions out, and your ventilation blood buffer system is helping, right, clear and remove those. And that means your muscle is, because the lactate's regenerating AD, is able to contract longer. And, and so it's a whole different way to look at metabolism. It takes the bad boy or girl right, look off lactate, and let's just look at the more direct, right, problems. And if you understand those, then you're better going to be able to solve the problems that confront, right, performance, right? So there's been just a lot of wasted time, money, energy in blaming lactic acid when it doesn't really exist in muscle. And again, people don't like me saying that, but that's the reality. We've got to move on. And many aspects of science and fitness industry and clinical practice, they've already moved on, right? The physicians, and these are some of the best physicians in the world at this conference I was at, they were telling me that, yeah, Rob, we've read your stuff for the last 10 years. We've changed our practice. We treat our patients differently, and everything's working wonderfully, just like, right, your data would suggest it would. So, people are moving on, and it's great. But yes, it just takes a long time for that to happen.
And can we say, with that knowledge now, can we say that the hydrogen ion is to blame?
Yeah, I mean, it is. But, the question about where does it come from is still up for grabs. And, I'm doing more research. I'm going to go back to the Czech Republic. They've invited me back. I'm going to do some research there later in the year and kind of finish up my benchtop biochem work on kind of showing that, well, I'll show which reactions cause a reduction in pH and which ones will cause an increase in pH. And, it's all to do with the chemical reaction. It's not to do with any acid behaving product that's formed. And, I hope to get that done this year, and that's really important. But, it's still, where do the hydrogen ions come from? Well, it's mostly water, right? Which is where they're coming from. I mean, and so understanding, the ionization of water and its involvement is quite complex. And so, we tend to want to think about the simplest answer, but if that's wrong, then we shouldn't be using it. Just because it's simple doesn't mean it's right. It's just convenient. But
and
it's embarrassingly wrong to pursue a explanation.
I think interestingly enough, I think making things simple and easy to understand is a skill and is important, especially for the layperson. I consider myself a total layperson when it comes to what you're sharing, and I'm trying to follow with as much tenacity in my brain that I have. But simple explanations make it easier for people like me to understand it. However, I think we should not sacrifice the essence and the essentials of what it actually means just to make it simpler to understand, right? We still have to stick to the fundamentals and then devise a way to make it as simple as possible for people to understand.
And there's still a simple explanation for acidosis. It's just that some chemical reactions release hydrogen ions, and that has nothing to do with the molecule being acidic. It's just that some chemical reactions release hydrogen ions. And whenever you break down an ATP molecule, it's pH modified, but at pH 7, there's a hydrogen ion release when you break down ATP. And other chemical reactions, when you move a phosphate group, right, which is really common in chemical reactions, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes it's associated with hydrogen ion exchange as well. So it's still simple, right? Chemical reactions cause the release of hydrogen ions, but it's just wrong to say that makes them acids, right? Because these hydrogen ions are released in reaction mechanisms that we don't chemically define as being acid molecules, right? Or acid reactions.
Can we say that this was a misnomer those 200 years ago?
Oh yeah, and it's an explainable misnomer, right? I mean, you can't blame the knowledgeable people, the educated, or the academics, or the scientists in the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century, because the knowledge base wasn't there, right? And the trouble with science, period, is we don't know what we don't know, and we're always making mistakes, and we always have to move on when we realize, with the advancement of knowledge and instruments, that, wow, that wasn't right. We've got to correct that. We've got to move on. And the slower we are at correcting errors, the more harm is done to society. And,
that's a good one.
You can get broader, right? That's why we're dealing with global warming, because we didn't know enough back when we should have about all the things that we're doing wrong. And Same
Mm-hmm.
with different levels of pollution, same with some medical practices that were not right 40, 50 years ago. We now know they weren't. And so we've changed them, right? We used to bed rest people after a heart attack, but we rapidly realized that they were still dying. And the sooner we got them up and moving around, right, the better. So, everything changes. And unfortunately, science isn't at fault. It's just we humans, we tend to just screw things up a lot when we try and do them. And it's no different in science, right? We make mistakes, but we just have to accept it and move on.
I think the big issue is that lots of people look towards science for guidance, which I do as well. And yet at the same time, I also recognize that it might be at fault to a certain extent. Yes, we have a body of evidence, right, that goes into a certain direction. And if this body of evidence is overwhelming, we can assume with lots of confidence that, hey, this seems to be the case, right? And yet at the same time, especially when it comes to a field like fitness, which seems to, lots of people call themselves now evidence-based practice. Yet, what does this even mean, right? When it comes to kettlebell training, for example, there's almost no or very, very small excerpts of scientific evidence concerning to kettlebell training, related to kettlebell training, which is such a sad thing. This is one of my missions that I have, to push this a little bit more into the scientific realm, because I see from practice the benefits that kettlebell training can provide on a standalone practice compared to barbells and dumbbells on machines, which is fascinating. But that's another topic. But I look towards science, but I know it might be at fault. And I think this is the best way to look at it. Hey, let's look at the evidence base. Let's look at where it leads us. And like you said, if we have an anomaly, isn't that the idea of randomized controlled trials and reviews? It's to find out, hey, can we replicate what this guy was doing? Or does it still hold if we put it up against some arguments? And if it holds up, yes, it seems to be the truth. If it doesn't, we have to adapt. It seems simple.
Yeah, I mean, the scientist's job is to identify a problem, devise a methodology that's best suited to answer the problem with the highest probability of getting the correct, I won't use the word right, but just the correct answer, and then reporting it and interpreting it right. And so it sounds quite straightforward, that science, but we can't research everything. And sometimes our instruments aren't as good as we need them to be. Sometimes our sample we use in the research may not be as representative as it should be. Sometimes we insert biases because of our prior education, right? That we don't control as well as we should. And then there are some questions that are just really hard for us to answer, right? I would love to be able to research elite athletes, but having access to a really, really elite athlete is next to impossible. And so a lot of the work done here in Australia, a lot of the work done on our elite athletes is done in our institutes of sport. And most of their data is not published because it's kind of kept in-house because they don't want to reveal their secrets, and what's working and isn't working. And so that's not really shared, which means it's outside the scientific umbrella, even though, there could be some phenomenal scientists doing that work. But if it's not shared, then it's not known. So it's not really changing on the knowledge base of society. But then we can't do some things for elite athletes, right? That we might want to do in research to really make it more based. So you don't want to get an elite athlete. We can't detrain them for 4 weeks, right?
Yeah, no, that's impossible.
Lose,
of
right?
course.
And we can't overtrain them, and we can't manipulate things that we'd want to. And so it's really hard. And so the more scientifically literate our fitness industry is, you're in a more research potential rich environment with your clientele than I can ever be in a university lab, just because of the access you have to certain individuals. And so just community-based scientific literacy, it's crucial, and it can help us learn more. And there are things you will see that you're doing that most of us in the academic world don't see because we don't get exposed to that environment that you're involved in. So that's kind of why I'm here. spreading the knowledge, spreading the awareness that, well, the evidence is crucial, and we have to use evidence to drive our understanding and practice as best as we can. And you can do that, right, in your environment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. And that's why I was a little bit opposed to this idea that we've had in the last podcast. I was opposed to the idea of thinking that we could use or we could single out a certain mechanism of our metabolism and then make it the devil and then say, let's avoid this altogether because it has this and this and this and that bad effect. Yeah. And I, from a really very easy to understand perspective, of course, I don't want to train, not even myself. I consider myself a little bit on an advanced level. I've been training for 15 years and on a regular basis, and I love doing this. But I also know this is not useful to destroy myself every day. If we don't have good recovery, good recuperation, I don't care how elite you are, you will destroy your body at the end of the day. If we always overdo it and we are training in a very exhausted state, we are not focused, we lack the skill, we don't have proper teaching, and we always think we have to go balls to the walls. Yes, this is detrimental. I don't have to read a book for this. I do understand it. But then to go out and say, well, this single mechanism is bad, let's avoid it. That's where this term anti-glycolytic came from in the last podcast, right? Which makes, I've listened to our podcast once again, I went a little bit deeper, and the more I think about this, the less it makes sense. Mm-hmm. There is no, anti-glycolytic is probably the only approach if we had this McArdle's disease that you shared the last time. Yes, these people are not able to use glycolysis. Yep. But to devise, and from your perspective, I think to devise a methodology that says this is anti-glycolytic or anti-PCR, or it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, an endurance athlete needs glycolysis, right, as well. It just fuels mitochondrial respiration from a carbohydrate metabolic perspective. And yeah, we went over that in really good detail last podcast, I think. And
yes.
Yeah, and glycolysis is crucial. And yeah.
When we look at the role of lactic acid, so and that was my understanding, and this is what I got from this book. They already changed it to a certain extent. These guys said, Precision Nutrition 2018, these guys said, hey, it's not actually lactic acid, doesn't seem to be the devil, but lactic acid helps in clearing the waste products, in our case, hydrogen ions from the muscle, so that the muscle can keep exerting energy and doesn't then stop contracting because it's too acidic. So
the only word I changed there is I just use lactate, right? And
okay.
I've been criticized before by scientists who said, well, Rob, these monocarboxylate transporters, that's what they call the proteins that help transport lactate and a hydrogen ion out. So well, when you have lactate and it's the protein also binds a hydrogen ion, then that's lactic acid. So let's call it lactic acid still. And I keep saying, well, no, they're not stoichiometric, which in science means, the cell is producing a lot more hydrogen ions than lactate. Just because they share a common transporter doesn't mean that, right, lactic acid's produced, and so on and so forth. Lactate, right? And that's just one of the, like I mentioned earlier, the efflux of hydrogen ions and lactate out of the cell is just one of the other benefits of lactate. But hydrogen ions would be released anyway without lactate, because there are other transporters, but it's certainly a very active one, and it certainly has a large share of the transport of hydrogen ions out of cells. But like I mentioned earlier, it's just, you got to get lactate out so the muscle can keep producing it, because otherwise there'd be what we call product inhibition of that reaction. So if there's too much lactate accumulating, you're not going to be able to produce as much of it, and that would be really bad for a energetically challenged cell like contracting muscle. So, and that's why I mentioned earlier about, the need to get lactate out, and, having higher blood lactates, might be a very important adaptation for really intense exercise.
So, but it still holds true then, because that's what you shared, just what you said now, because I have to wrap my head around this. from my basic understanding with the hydrogen ions, which I have gotten the knowledge too, which is from 2018. Yes, these guys, they cause trouble in the muscle. So therefore, lactate is released and grabs the hydrogen ions and throws them out the muscle. Very basic
Yeah.
understanding. Is
Well,
that true?
the protein the protein associates with lactate and it associates separately with a hydrogen ion, right? And then they get removed from the cell.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that the construct we're looking at is for the muscle. The hydrogen ion issue is not the problem. The hydrogen ion gets more problematic once it gets into the circulation in excess rates and it exceeds buffering capacity and blood pH goes down. So the systemic acidosis is more our holistic problem than acidosis in muscle. Now, don't get me wrong, getting acidic in muscle, it does change the function of some enzymes. That's been shown in research. But from a muscle contractile power generation perspective, the evidence is pretty clear now that, wow, muscle in low pH can still contract and generate force just like it wasn't in an acidic condition. So from a contractile power, right, mechanism perspective, metabolically it might delay, some energy transfer, but from a contractile mechanism, muscle's fine in an acidic environment.
Okay, so with that understanding, what causes the muscle then to stop contracting, or what's the issue?
Yeah, we touched on that last time, and again, we've known this for 50 years. When muscle is contracting intensely, and we'll just go down to the cellular level, right? And so it's breaking down ATP at a fast rate, and it can't keep up the ATP supply from the mitochondria, right? And so then you get more glycolytic ATP being produced, right? And you start breaking down creatine phosphate, and it's adding to the ATP. And there's some mitochondrial respiration going on, but it's just not fast enough to match the demand. So that means you're getting ATP broken down, and there's ADP and inorganic phosphate, and then also hydrogen ions. And now inorganic phosphate could go into the mitochondria, but if it's being produced so rapidly and the mitochondrial rate isn't fast enough to take them in and use them to regenerate ATP, inorganic phosphate accumulates, ADP accumulates a little bit, and of course hydrogen ions can accumulate. Now, when inorganic phosphate, just the phosphate group that is coming off ATP to release the energy, that can accumulate from like 4 millimoles at rest to 35, 40 millimoles per liter during really, really intense 2 to 3 minutes to failure exercise. And it's got negative charges, right? And those negative charges, right, interact with calcium. And when they interact with calcium, it decreases the availability of calcium to bind with troponin for the muscle, right, to have contraction, and you compromise on force development. And we've known this for 50 years or so, but again, lactic acid dominated the vernacular about being blamed for contractile failure. But we've known from really elaborate animal studies since the 1950s that, wow, you raise muscle phosphate concentrations, you lower available calcium, right? And that coincides with decreased force production in the animal models of muscle contraction. And so the experimental evidence is first class. We know one leads to the other, right, in these experimental studies. And that's the culprit, right? So if there's a molecule in muscle we want to blame for being a culprit, it's not lactic acid, and there's not acidosis and hydrogen ions. It's phosphate accumulation. That's the problem.
Okay, that's what I was trying to ask now. And just playing devil's advocate, can somebody then say, well, that's animal studies, right? Doesn't mean that this translates to humans.
Yeah, but we know from, again, if you go back to, I mentioned earlier, this method where if you use a magnetic resonance right? Machine, instrument, an
Mm-hmm.
MRI magnet,
MRI, yeah, yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And you provide what's called a peripheral coil, and you actually turn the instrument into now a really advanced chemical instrument rather than an
Mm-hmm.
imaging instrument. You can actually
Mm-hmm.
quantify inorganic phosphate, creatine phosphate. You can measure through
Ah.
computations muscle pH, and we know with really this research now dates back to the 1970s, but boy, in the last 10 years, with our increased magnet strengths, we get great data on looking at inorganic phosphate accumulation in intensely contracting muscle. We have all the data in humans as well, non-invasively nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
So
Great. Okay.
yeah, it's that's just old hat. Physiologists have known that for decades and decades. But again, this
Okay.
lactic acid construct,
And,
it's
and,
just
and
hard to get.
I was taught this too. It's yes, lactic acid is the problem. This is
Yeah,
what causes the muscle to stop contracting. So if I may unpack this a little bit, because there's so much information that I have to really digest a little bit. So we know the muscle is able to contract even if the pH level is decreased. So
yeah,
the hydrogen ions is not the problem, okay? Even if we have a large accumulation of hydrogen ions, which
yeah,
decreases the pH, the muscle is still able to contract. That's fine,
yeah, yeah.
right? Okay, so
Totally.
that's point. Okay,
Yeah,
point A. Then point B is okay. The problem that the muscle cannot exert force anymore because the myosin and the actin, they cannot contract anymore, is because calcium is taken away from the muscle through the phosphagen increase in the muscle cell.
yeah.
Is
I wouldn't be so absolute, but so
okay? That's
there's a proportion of calcium that's removed from what we call the free calcium pool, and
yes,
but
yes.
there's not as much calcium to be able to be used each contraction cycle, and then we have compromised contractile force. So
Okay, and that
yeah,
has nothing to do with lactate.
no,
Okay,
yeah,
okay. So I mean, this is so fascinating because it's like okay, it used to be lactic acid, right? And let's take the acid away because it's a misnomer, right? Just say lactate
yeah, I'd say, yeah,
is the issue of why you cannot exert force or contract if that your muscle lacks contractile energy or power during a workout or during training is because lactate interferes with your muscle on a basic level. That's not true. It has nothing to do with it.
no,
Okay. Okay. And this has been challenged by you for years. And how did it even how you've shared that
the
yes those
acidosis
hundreds
part has, yeah,
yeah
I've
so these
focused on the acidosis part.
So these hundreds of years ago, of course, we cannot blame these guys. They were on the quest for truth like everybody else today
Yeah.
is, but they didn't have the knowledge, of course. But how did they arrive at the conclusion then that if we know it's a phosphagen problem in the muscle, right, that takes away the calcium, where does this lactate idea come from?
Um, Convenience and laziness, if I was to be brutally
Okay,
honest.
okay,
Right? I mean,
okay.
really, I mean, that's the brutal honesty of it all. Uh, and yeah, I won't go into any more negatives. I get into enough
Yeah, yeah,
trouble
man.
with my colleagues.
I do understand.
But but no,
So
actually,
interesting,
let
so
me
fascinating.
be a little bold, right? And so let's just say that knowledge is diffuse, and peer-reviewed journals, right, are reviewed by peers, and if they are in line with the lactic acid construct, it's a reinforcement of the mainstream, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
and that all takes a long time. Grants, the same thing. Grants are peer reviewed. If you rock the boat by doing something that's non-mainstream, right? So there are all these reinforcements that come together to
Mm-hmm.
continue the inertia of
Mm-hmm.
a prevailing
Fascinating.
paradigm. And
Fascinating.
there are scientific historians that have documented this. Um, Thomas Kuhn was the main one, and back in the 60s, who revealed that, oh gosh, this has been going on for centuries, right? This propagation of convenience over more rigorous critical inquiry, and science just has to deal with that. And we have to train and educate our scientists better about being aware of, it's just, you've got to be, the biggest fear, my biggest fear all the time is, am I promoting a incorrect construct, right? And that's what led me on this quest back in the 90s, because I didn't want to teach my students something that was becoming more clear to me to be wrong, because I think the worst thing an academic could do in a university is teach incorrect knowledge, right? We're there to, because of our education and intelligence, to know the difference between what's real and not real, but it's sometimes it's hard, and like I said, we don't know what we don't know, but our job is to really read and understand and challenge, so that we make sure that knowledge is as good as we can make it be, and that's my quest. That's just that's the scientist I want to be, and I would hope all scientists would want to be.
And you're mentioning the fear. I think I do understand your point, and from another perspective, I think if sincerity is behind your intent, then you don't have to fear to teach something wrong, because you sincerely think that this is the right way. And as soon as that right way gets challenged, I think this is where the issue is, right? Then the fear of being wrong is not a problem if it's pointed out that what you're teaching or what you're saying is wrong. Then there's only one logical conclusion, and that is to adapt.
Yeah.
All right. Until then, you just, like these guys who went before us. They were. I think many of them were sincere, and they thought this is the way to go. For example, there's a small story which I think is so interesting. There's this huge scientific field around back pain, right? And non-disclosed. I forgot the term. It's back pain where they don't know where it comes from, right? And there's a huge scientific endeavor to understand this topic. And what I see from a very, very small perspective that we have, not just back pain, and I'm not talking about chronic back pain or people who have structural damages or whatever have it, just regular back pain or regular shoulder pain, just as what part of the human condition. What we are experiencing is that oftentimes it seems to be it's a lack of strength. In our case, people come to us with pain. We start training them on a regular basis, whole body, the whole body's moving. We do lots of pressing, we do lots of swings, lots of exercises for the midsection, and knee pain is eliminated or reduced, hip pain is eliminated or reduced, shoulder pain. So from my perspective, what I see is, hey, why are we always talking about these different biomechanical realities and go into a scientific endeavor when sometimes, why don't we talk about lack of strength? What I'm sometimes believe it's missing to a certain extent. Of course, this is just my very bird's eye perspective. I'm not a professional in that regard. But what I see is just from these guys who went before me, they said strength is the natural companion of health, right? So why not attack this back pain problem or the issue with, let's just make sure strength is granted in all these necessary areas. Let's build strength in a solid scientific way. And if after months of solid strength training, supervised with a good doses, then if the strength still if the pain still remains, yes, we can go then further. So what I'm really digressing a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is sometimes I believe we are diverting away from what is essential, and then we look into all these other areas instead of just focusing on the essentials to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's all logical. Yeah, strength and balance. Yeah.
And this is one,
yeah. I mean, we're teaching that to our students, because in Australia we have clinical exercise physiology as a main discipline. That is the clinical arm of, mainstream exercise science. And they do a lot of, there's a lot of research out of physiotherapy in the US, so physiotherapy in Australia or physical therapy in the US. And I'm not sure what it's called in Europe. that would, support all that. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's totally in line with, latest evidence base. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And I
Yeah.
believe that the kettlebell deserves a place in this realm of clinical practice or clinical strength training, because it works the midsection so well. It has corrective measures built into it. It's endurance, it's strength, it's postural correction. It's all these beautiful things all at once. This is what makes kettlebell training so fascinating. That's why I believe it has its place, or it deserves its place. But that's a long way to
Yeah,
go.
that's good. That's right. Be a pioneer,
Yeah.
but have patience.
Exactly. My
Yeah.
my final question, Rob, would be: we've talked about a little bit the details of it, which I have to re-listen to the podcast to really get a firm understanding of it. But let's talk a little bit conclusive. So, based on this prior understanding of lactate, what was the conclusion back then? You've mentioned that based on the current understanding, doctors are changing the way they treat patients. So, what was the conclusion back then, or what was the issue or the problem attached with thinking that lactate is a bad thing, or that lactate acid even exists?
Yeah. It's a convoluted problem, right? Because back how I was taught, right, was that, well, if we accept lactic acid, then we know what our hydrogen source is, and then if we measure lactate, right, we can say, well, that's the dissociated version of lactic acid, and then that helps us understand what the acid load was. And so that led into then understanding and quantifying buffer capacity, and the whole field of acid-base physiology and chemistry was around, okay, let's, lactic acid, then we can quantify the acid load, then we get this pH change, we know how much buffering there is, we can monitor this, that, and the other. So it was a very convenient model, and it fueled a lot of research, but my work suggests that the proton load is about 4 times the amount of lactate that's produced, right? So the chemical reactions that support muscle contraction collectively release about 4 times the hydrogen ions than we produce lactate. So the stoichiometry in reality isn't there. So again, it was convenient. It made it easy to research acid-base physiology, and that was just self-reinforcing. And there you have it, the last 40, 50 years that, dominated, lactic acid dominated how we understood the cause of the acidosis and how we could quantify it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was tidy, right? It was just really tidy. And unfortunately, the minds of the time didn't stop and think about, well, it doesn't really make any sense. And again, that's just routine. I mean, we get caught up in what we do, and you know, no scientist is perfect. We all make mistakes, and
Mm-hmm.
that's just the nature of the business. But that's
And
my
what
explanation of it all. It was just so tidy, right? It was just easier to teach. It was
easier
easier
to
to
teach? Mm-hmm.
understand, easier
Mm-hmm.
to understand, and
Mm-hmm.
helped fuel other avenues of inquiry, like I mentioned about buffering and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But every, I mean, this story could be told 1,000 times over in different disciplines. It's just we
Mm-hmm.
just change the topic, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It'd be just
Mm-hmm.
something else that's measured that ends up, not necessarily being right. It's just a
And it
common
doesn't make
story,
sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and it's been
Mm-hmm.
repeated for the last 200 years on different topics, and so nothing new. It's yeah.
So you've mentioned the details of it. So my question was, what was the result of that thinking in clinical practice, for example, thinking that lactate is the bad guy?
Um, well, so pre changes, I can only comprehend that, and I don't know the true answer, because, to be honest, and I'm kicking myself now, because I should have been asking my intensive care physician colleagues, well,
Mm-hmm.
what did you do,
Yeah,
50
before. Yeah. Yeah.
before, and they probably would have been working really hard to lower lactate, and they probably would have been giving, bicarbonate buffer solutions, a ringer solution that was buffer the hydrogen ions in a different way, and you know, it would have been something like that. And some of those approaches would have still been successful. I mean, if you give a buffer, you can give different buffers and just lowering hydrogen ions. But I think the mentality was, rather than wasting effort and concern about lactate, right, let's just put that effort and concern into what we know to be the inflammation that's occurring in blood poisoning, like sepsis, or the inflammation that's occurring in cardiovascular disease or severe diabetes, the added damage in cells. You know, that's the more direct mechanism that they're now having time to focus on, because they're not sidetracked by worrying about, you know, the lactic acid side of it, or the lactate that they measure, which would have formed, you know, part of the lactic acid construct back then. So they've just freed up time and energy to focus more on the mechanism, and treatment. That's kind of how I look at it. And then treatments then just improve because they're now focusing more on the mechanistic problem, not right, the peripheral issue.
So it's like, hey, let's stop looking at this issue because it's actually not an issue anymore.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
right.
Let's focus our attention on the other stuff that is more, life and death, right, determinants.
And from an exercise perspective, what if we look at the conclusion from your research? What is the result, and what is the conclusion from an exercise perspective for somebody like me with this understanding?
Well, some colleagues of mine say, Rob, it doesn't really change anything. You're just talking about labels. But, you know, I think it does, because, you know, when I teach students about metabolism and acidosis, you know, lactate can only be talked about in a positive frame, and it helps them better understand the importance of glycolysis and why we need to keep it going as best as we can. And even though there are hydrogen ions released, you know, that ATP yield from glycolysis is really, really important. And then it speaks to then understanding the difference between the muscle fiber types of the different motor units. And if you're naturally low in mitochondria and you're more reliant on glycolysis, and you have a lower capacity to consume hydrogen ions into the mitochondria and a lower capacity to bring in the inorganic phosphate, then your understanding of metabolism becomes very more empowered, because you now get into a motor unit recruitment determination of change in metabolism. And so the more fast twitch motor units you have, the more problematic you're going to be. You can generate more power, and you can be incredibly explosive, and you can move faster. But, you know, there's a metabolic cost to that, because your mitochondrial capacity is constrained, and you'll become more acidic, and you'll eventually still get contractile failure, but you'll be more powerful along the way, right? And to me, it just makes teaching more dynamic. It's more interesting. You now understand, the whole role of lactate in consuming hydrogen ions, and then it gives you a different take on understanding acid-base balance. So I think it's really informing and empowering. And so it's certainly changed the way I teach, and I would think that it's changed the way most exercise physiologists now teach. So it's more than just nomenclature. It's really looking at the main metabolic pathway, which is glycolysis, in a totally different light, appreciating other chemical reactions for their involvement in the source of the hydrogen ions. And, you know, the whole thing about education is that if you're focused on the truth, who knows where that can take you, because down the track, we just don't know, right, how that's going to be really more important. But if we know that it's factually right, there's one thing you can be sure of. It's just that sometime down the road, wow, it's going to be powerfully important, but we just don't know when. But so, yeah, that's kind of how I reply to my critics about that. It's just so much more than just a name.
It's the truth change is worth pursuing, right?
Yeah.
And just from my understanding of lactate now, if we look at that power athlete that you've mentioned, so would you, from an exercise perspective, would you consider it important to make sure that the power athlete improves his lactate production, so to speak?
Well, I've had a few good discussions with a lot of our applied physiologists in our sports centres around Australia, and I've just encouraged them to look at their lactate data because they still do blood lactate testing. And I've just said to them, look at your data, and I would hypothesize that your best power athletes have higher lactates than your poorer power athletes. And, and that would be totally consistent with what we've just been talking about. And so instead of treating lactate as a bad thing, there are certain sports activities which tend to be the higher power ones where, you're at an advantage if you can pump out more lactate because of its importance to keeping glycolysis going. So, and then, a high power athlete, if they do too much endurance training, is going to lower their power, right? So there's a negative drawback to saying, let's get more mitochondria, but then you're going to de-adapt your power, right? Systems of the muscle. So, that's the balance the more elite athlete training coaches, applied physiologists are working into. And but if I went to a sports academy or one of our state-based Institute of Sport, I'd be wanting to see the lactate data for athletes in the power domain and to see how it differs to the endurance domain. And, and I'd say, wow, look at this lactate in this person. Is he or she one of your more elite athletes in the power, right, performance world? And I would say that they probably are, would be my hypothesis. So in that context, it's all a bit different as well. And my take is that most sports coaches and more elite sports physiologists are now, that's their mindset, right? That's just where they're at now based upon the re-emergence of a different perspective in understanding, lactate in elite sport.
So it would have been quantified differently those years ago when you look at high blood lactate levels, and you'd be like, oh, that's an issue.
Yeah, it would have been interpreted differently. Yeah.
Right. And nowadays you understand, oh, that's more of the elite ones because they have more of the good thing, not more of the bad thing.
If muscle contractile power is a vital determinant to their performance, sure. Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why elite athletes have to specialize. It's give and take. You have to deal with this issue because you're specializing down that path. So you have to accept that we cannot get the benefits from the other side of the realm because then you lose in your specialty.
Yeah.
So
it's a real balancing act on your training priorities. And yes.
And that makes it so fascinating. Yeah.
That's why the coaches get paid the big bucks, right? They, and not all coaches, have a PhD, but I don't really think they need to. I mean, if they understand the basics and they understand their athletes, then, they're empowered to apply that as best as they can. Yeah.
That's why I think it's so important to have these discussions. I mean, from my perspective, I don't train elite athletes, but just from the perspective of getting the academic arm to influence my thinking and the way we do things, because we have, like you said, we are exposed to the experience that you probably don't have, right? But then I get exposed to the scientific evidence and to the data that I don't have, and then if we put this together, this is exactly what makes the most sense to move forward.
Yeah. There really needs to be a good bridge between academia, the knowledge of academia, and the function of industry. With viewing the fitness industry as I mentioned, being an industry, and I think we're getting there. I know in Australia that's really encouraged. We have a lot of connections with all our institutes of sports, as in university exercise scientists, and the same is true in the US model, right? They have their Olympic training centers, and many university academics do research for those establishments, and that's good. Yeah, that's really good.
One thing that I would really welcome is if this would extend to just coaches like me. It's most of the time we're focused on the big institutions collaborating with each other, which is great. But I think there's millions of trainers out there who have a small practice or gyms or just I think the biggest part of the fitness industry is just these small little moving parts. And this is how I think would or a measurement or a system where we can influence these moving parts as a whole, not as a regulatory sense, but more like as an educational sense, where people can really get this, let's say, unbiased perspective on how things really work. Because in fitness, it's just as biased and even tribal to talk about stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
Science is it's human, like it's part of human
yeah,
beings.
yeah, yeah. No, and there's part of that within science, within science and academia as well. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Eventually, you would hope that competence relates to knowledge and proven effectiveness in your
Hmm.
professional practice, and then that
Hmm.
builds on your earning income potential, and that earning income potential then drives other people to realize that's where they need to be successful. And and hopefully it's a snowballing effect. But and here we're using social media. Sometimes I think social media is a bit of a nemesis because it allows the
Hmm.
propagation of misinformation,
Hmm.
maybe more than it does real information.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it's just a matter of having some faith. I tell my students the reason why you're doing an exercise science degree is to be a little bit more competent than your competitors. And if the
Hmm.
marketplace is based on success and performance, then it's a self-correcting paradigm where you'll be more successful because you're more competent. Um, and
Rob,
I don't know whether that's idealistic thinking or not, but
yes,
you know,
I would challenge that thinking a little bit because I have learned in the last couple of weeks, and that it's proven in our not only our income but also how the business and the system grows is it's all about marketing. So one of the
yeah,
most important skills that exercise degree, because I see this often. It's like when other trainers who follow us or we have communications with them and they have an exercise science degree. At the end of the day, nobody cares. It's all about solid marketing and
mm,
understanding how to make a message that is boring sexy, to make it
mhm.
sell well. And one of the greatest statements that I've heard from a coach that I live by is you first have to give people what they want and then you give people what they need.
Yeah, get them in and then modify.
It's
Yeah,
it's it's the truth, and the funny thing is, and one guy said you can either be right or you can be rich, right? So it's understanding
well, that
that's an issue. The issue that I'm having is because I'm taking these marketing lessons, and from these marketing course that I'm having, the issue that I'm having, that I'm experiencing, is you can get away with the least amount of knowledge and the least amount of scientific evidence if you have a strong marketing game,
yeah,
and you'll take away all right at the end of the day. Yes, probably when that system churns out when these people go through these systems, they're burned out or they're it's a wasteland afterwards, but they still get all of the attention because their marketing is so solid. And I can give you a little inside knowledge from the marketing course that I had. We had this Q&A session. So this one guy shows up, a young trainer, who says, well, we write diet plans or nutrition plans according to blood types. And so my alarm bells was like, there's no scientific evidence for that stuff to
yeah.
even exist. But it doesn't matter
It
because,
sounds good. Yeah.
yeah, it sounds good. And if
That's,
this guy has a solid marketing game, nobody cares if it's true or if it's false.
well, that
So
just
that,
speaks to the basic level of misunderstanding of the public, right? So if
mm-hmm,
the less educated the public is, it's a dilemma, right?
mm-hmm,
They're ripe for exploitation.
mm-hmm,
And again, history of humanity, it shows that in all these different areas. Yeah,
mm-hmm. But
yeah,
still, let's not lose hope.
that's
And
right. Yeah,
I think it's two things. I think for the academics or for the folks who get into this field, especially fitness, let's not lose hope, be science based, and get a hold of solid marketing skills. This is the last part is missed out by so many. They think that the science and the competence is the only thing that is needed to be successful, when at the end of the day, the marketing skill is one of the most important one, which from my perspective.
Yeah, no,
But
very good.
it's fascinating. My final question: could you really boil it down, acidosis, the conversation that we just had? Could you boil it down to a very, very entry level understanding of what you just shared, of how the science has changed for a coach who just signed up, who is listening to the podcast, and maybe at the end is like, hey man, I didn't understand the word, because I do understand some of it, but really ultimate layman's terms. Yeah,
the hard question at the end. Well, so one, the evidence is that cells don't produce metabolic acid molecules. So acidosis isn't caused by the production of acid molecules. Acidosis is caused by hydrogen ion exchange in certain chemical reactions, and these chemical reactions that don't produce acids, right, is the cause of the source of the hydrogen ions. So that means then don't have a bad attitude about lactate, right? Lactate actually helps consume hydrogen ions, and it's a very beneficial molecule for muscle cells to function as we want them to during more intense exercise. And yes, lactate's a good marker for a change in metabolism, which mostly is occurring because your motor unit recruitment is moving into fast twitch motor units. So that better informs you about what's going on, right, with muscle recruitment and muscle mass. And you can better understand the trainability of your athlete by maybe, if they're a power athlete, by their ability to actually now have higher blood lactates. And that might be, there's an argument for that to be a really beneficial sign of an adaptation for your more elite power, right, athletes. To me, that's it in a nutshell. It's not more complex than that. That says it all, and it gives a different view of lactate than the historically conventional paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Great. That sums it up. Yeah, that sums it up very beautifully. And another final question after the final question. Lactate, the can be improved, because if we look at it, I understand it's the good guy actually. So lactate levels, or the body's capability of producing lactate, can be improved by exercising, or is this also a genetic predisposition for some folks?
Both. I mean, the more fast twitch muscle you have, the more you're going to be producing lactate for any exercise stimulus, right? And the research.
And what's the reason for that, if I may interject?
Well, just because for any exercise movement, the less slow twitch motor units you have, the earlier you're going to start recruiting fast twitch motor units, and that's going to be a causal to more lactate production. Okay. Because they have less mitochondria. Okay. So genetics is a lot, right? Genetics is also incredibly an important story, and we didn't have time to get into a lot of that. But if you look back at this, podcast, you'll be hearing every now and then I'll be talking about motor unit recruitment, fast twitch motor unit recruitment, and so it's really important. And there was another part to your question there. I forget what it was.
The genetic predisposition. I think you've answered that.
Yeah, so that our motor unit proportions are pretty much determined soon after our first or second year of living. So they're mostly laid down in the womb, and they're slightly modified after birth, and then you. Unless you de-innovate your muscle, there's no way to get it changed. And there's a lot of controversy out there in the research, but generally speaking, right, it's really, 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 really difficult to change your fiber type, right, percentages.
The makeup,
proportions. And, that's why elite athletes are born and not made is it's a logical, simple synopsis of all that. And you can't train a sprint runner to be a marathoner, and you can't train a marathoner, right, to be a sprint runner. that would be the extreme, right?
And yeah, and
Interpretation.
the extreme is always. I've had books, read books from Dr. Michael Yesis, who was a very famous biomechanist who introduced some of the Soviet ideas in training philosophy back when the Soviet Union broke down with Dr. Yuri Verkhoshansky and all these guys. And he said something interesting. He said, yes, from an extreme perspective, the genetics play a role, the marathon runner, the sprinter. But in team sports, for example, it's lots and lots and lots of training that can influence, right?
There's a balance of fast twitch, slow twitch. I mean, a lot of competitive team sports require power and endurance, and you've got to be a mixed muscle person, to do that. And what the proportionality is, right, depends, and it depends on your position, right, in that sport as to what is more preferable, and and again, it all adds to the complexity of individualized coaching programs even within a sport, because the positions are different.
There's so when you look at the human being, it's so complex, all these systems that happen, but we are driven by the need to make it as simple as possible to understand. This is kind of like a dichotomy that we have to live with, especially when you train folks. It's the same thing. You want to make it as easy to understand, but sometimes it's not that easy. And but that's a lot that we've been dealt with. And but I truly enjoy this, and I enjoy these discussions. And I'm so happy that I've reached out to you based on our last conversation, because just things didn't seem to make sense to me. And if I'm a very big proponent of, if I hear somebody say something, I look at their credentials, where they come from. And sometimes we fitness folks, we make the mistake that we reach out into so many different areas. We talk about biochemistry, we talk about general physical preparation, we talk about special physical preparation, we talk about training the layperson, we talk about the athletic population. And these are all separate individual fields that you can only get very good at if you dedicate your time to this individual field. So if I hear one professional touch all on these bases with very conclusive or absolutist views, I'm always skeptical, because I think it's just impossible for a trainer, or for a coach, even if you have legendary status, to understand the biochemistry to an extent like a scientist can understand it, who studied the field for 50 years like you have.
It's all a balance. I mean, I think my greatest attribute, and I think my supervisors and my amazing good luck at having the education I have, is I've got a pretty broad base, and so I'm widely educated on a lot of topics, and so I can think about the body across multiple systems, quite effectively. And I think most exercise physiologists have that potential, but sometimes we're over specialized within exercise physiology. So I think the more knowledge you know about different systems, because they all work together, we're relying on everything working at once, and that makes an exercise physiologist who's well trained a pretty good commodity in any
100%
wide or research based endeavor.
Yeah, and I do understand the need to be able to understand these different fields. Where I'm just a little bit concerned is when I hear somebody being very conclusive about it. Where I'm like, I'm not sure if you're really that deep into that field to be that conclusive, right? And that's just but that's just me.
No, that's true. I pat you on the back for that observation. Yeah, that's good.
Appreciate that. Robert, well, I really thank you for your time. This is these are such valuable discussions that these are the types of podcasts that I have to listen to over and over again, because it's outside my scope of practice, where I can learn more and more about it, and realizing at the end that I don't know anything. But I think that's the Socratic way of looking at it, is the more you learn, the less you know.
That's true.
But I truly appreciate your time, and thank you so much for appearing. And we can do this again if you have other types of areas in that acidosis realm that you want to talk about and you want to share. I've read in your manuscripts that you're about to work on your third one, right? The first one is where you were unpacking the historic side of things. The second one is the evidence base. And now your third will be focused on
why science can get it so wrong for so long.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay. You're going to make a lot of friends with this, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so that's still in review, and I've got to do a few edits and tone it down a little bit. But I'll let you know when that's published, and
yes,
I'll let you know what any other any topic I would feel comfortable talking on. I'll just shoot you a list and
yes.
Let me know if I can help whatever. That's fine.
We help aspiring kettlebell coaches become confident as kettlebell practitioners and educators in only 10 weeks. If you want to find out more about our method, check the first link in the description and sign up for our waiting list.